enjoyed your talk. I especially liked you showing all of the women who've been involved, because I think at least once at every psychedelic conference I go to, someone shows a timeline of all of the important people in the history of psychedelics. Of course, that started when like a man discovered a psychedelic. And then that sort of becomes, I don't know, what our understanding of the history of psychedelics, and people think that there were like no women or people of color involved. So I made a new timeline, by the way, that's only women and people of color. And I have no issue leaving the men out, but whatever. We should just do that next time. All right. So yeah, so it's great to be here, and I just want to start off by saying that I'm at the University of Ottawa. Here's some of the members on my team there. We have a great bunch. I mean, this is just a few of them, and so many students that have come really just because they're interested in psychedelics, and then others who came for other reasons because they're interested in the diversity and equity work that we do, and then became interested in psychedelics too. And so, and so they really are the ones kind of behind the scenes, helping make everything happen. And so, I want to just take a minute to acknowledge my team at U Ottawa, because they're all fantastic people. All right. So yeah, and also in addition to my team at the University of Ottawa, I have collaborators that I have gotten to know over the years, from early work that I started doing with MAPS to to work all over the country in the US and Canada and Europe and South America, and just sort of great people everywhere. And I want to also take a minute and thank them for kind of being on this journey with me. And there's just a few of them there. So one of my main research interests is racism. That's what I study, and the way racism impacts our mental health and our society. And I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Is that? Yeah. And the mental health impact of racism. And so one of the things that I usually want to start with is just defining racism, because I think all of us feel like we know what it is, but often it's much larger than we imagine. So it's not just that white nationalist group that's, fighting to maintain their Confederate statues. It's really baked into everything. And I am still hearing an echo. Hold on, it might be coming from this computer. There we go, I think. Okay. So again, we have many types of racism, and most of the racism that we're dealing with on a daily basis is really a more covert kind of racism, which means it is in the form of implicit bias. It comes out as microaggressions or subtle acts. Certainly there are major acts of discrimination that are happening all the time, but there's also these more subtle acts that can be equally harmful just because of the frequency of which they happen. And then additionally, we have racism that's sort of baked into all of our laws, our policies, and our procedures that operate to advantage white people at the expense of people of color. And these policies and procedures and laws were made this way by design. It's not an accident that they're that way. And they can perpetuate racism without anybody actually necessarily doing a racist act. And so this is what we mean when we say racism is systemic, in that it's kind of woven into everything, and it operates as a system to advantage some people at the expense of others. Oops, how do I go back? Oh, so in terms of psychedelic science, when I first became involved in doing this work, it was with MAPS, and they had reached out to me and said, hey, we're doing these research studies and we would really like to increase the diversity of our research studies. And so I started working with them to first figure out what the problem was and then how it could be addressed. And I remember very vividly showing up for a MAPS meeting with a bunch of the leaders and PIs from the different sites that the studies were being run. And the room was like almost entirely white people. And I thought, I think I have discovered the problem. We need to diversify our research teams and our leadership, and also make a concerted effort to make sure people of color are included as research participants, because as we know, when we don't have diversity in the research participants, the findings of our research are not generalizable to everyone. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want effective treatments that are good for everyone. And so our research team, we did a kind of a deep dive into the literature. We looked at all of the randomized controlled trials of psychedelics that had happened globally, and to see what the representation was. And the findings were that, the vast majority of participants in the vast majority of studies where they even bothered to report demographic information were white. And there were very few studies that had any meaningful numbers of people of color. There were 1 or 2 studies that were specifically focused on communities of color, but for the most part, the people of color weren't included. We did a follow-up study also looking at ketamine trials that had been done for major depressive disorder. And again, we found a widespread exclusion. And so everywhere you look in this space, there's exclusion. And so one of the things I've been doing is really calling out this important problem, bringing light into the issue, and encouraging everyone to think about how we can make these spaces more inclusive, how we can have more people of color as researchers, and how we can recognize the great work that's actually already being done by so many people of color that continues to be overlooked. Another concern I've had is, in addition to how psychedelics may be helpful, how might they be harming people of color? And here's one example of weaponization of psychedelics. So for those of you who may not be aware of this, sometimes law enforcement uses ketamine to subdue suspects that they believe are suffering from what is called excited delirium. And then they may call paramedics or somebody, some quasi-medical person to come and administer ketamine to the person that basically they want to control. And this is not safe. There have been many people who have been harmed or killed through being subdued by ketamine. And here's one example of Elijah McClain, who was actually not doing anything wrong, kind of minding his own business when he was approached by law enforcement, and actually, like, footage that they looked at later saw that he wasn't resisting police, but for some reason they decided that he was having excited delirium, and he was given double the dose of what he should have had of ketamine, and he died. And he's not the only one. So and usually in these situations, really nothing happens to the perpetrators, who made that call. And I should point out that there really is no diagnosis called excited delirium. And even if there was, like, law enforcement officers are not the people to make that call. So as a result of this and some other deaths of Black men who weren't doing anything wrong when they were given ketamine, this happened in Colorado. They don't do this again in Colorado, but they do in many other states. And so one concern is always that, okay, so we've got these great, potential new-ish technologies for helping people. And my question is always, and how are we going to end up using them to harm people of color? Because that's always what happens. And so, one question that I think it's worth putting out there is, can psychedelics bring us together? Because I hear this a lot from people in these psychedelic spaces, like psychedelics are advanced as sometimes the answer to some of our problems around inequities and conflicts around race, ethnicity, and culture, psychedelics can be the answer for that. And I think that I actually do have hope that this can be part of that answer, but in and of themselves, I would say no, because you have to have intention. You have to have intention and want to grow and change and learn. You have to want to understand your own biases and how you can be a better citizen of the world by treating everyone as equals. And so until people have that willingness, then I would say psychedelics won't necessarily be the answer for bringing us together. But I think if people are willing to courageously look inward and start to do some excavations into those dark corners that keep them, I would say, separated from other members of the human race, then I think they can be an avenue for this. And so now I want to talk a little bit about what I've been doing in my lab to respond to this challenge around promoting equity in psychedelic science and practice. So one of the things that our lab really wanted to tackle, and we started doing this when we were involved with the MDMA trials that MAPS has been spearheading, is looking at culturally informed psychedelic assisted therapies. And so what we did when we started working with MAPS was basically look at all of the procedures of the study, from informed consent and recruitment to treatment and follow-up, and say, hey, how might this not be serving people of color, and what do we need to think about and do differently? And so we discovered many things that needed to be examined, that could be adjusted. Some things that were problems, but we couldn't actually fix them because certain decisions had already been made. And I just want to underscore the importance of getting someone with experience in culturally informed research methodology in your study on the front end, and not bring them in at the end, because then sometimes it's hard to make some of these changes. And generally, we were able to make a lot of progress, and that also included doing things like, for example, helping the independent raters understand racial trauma and know how to identify that when they're assessing for PTSD, because some of those raters end up being the gatekeepers of entry into a study. And if, for example, they're looking for PTSD, but they don't know that racial trauma can be PTSD, then those participants might not be included, for example. Other things include, for example, the informed consent. If there's language in the informed consent that might be off-putting to certain groups, that might pose a barrier to participation. So there are many different places throughout the research study where changes were recommended in order to improve the experience and participation of people of color. We wrote a paper about it that appeared in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies that I encourage anybody who's a researcher to take to heart, because I often have people asking me, how can we make our studies more inclusive? And I'm like, I already wrote that paper, so you would know. So just go read it. All right, and then if you have questions, you can ask after that. Another thing that we've been very interested in doing is psychedelic assisted therapy specifically for racial trauma in people of color. And this is one area we were really planning on zeroing in on during the expanded access phase of the MAPS trials, but for many different reasons, they decided to go a different direction with how that was going to work. So we didn't have a chance to do that, but this is still an important part of our research agenda. And we did publish a case study on ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD related to experiences of racial discrimination. And we're continuing to do work in this area. Another area where we're very interested in exploring how psychedelics can be used for racial trauma is in groups that are using psychedelic plant medicines, for example, retreats and ceremonies, where people may have the opportunity to heal in a group setting. And summer, a year before last, 2022, I organized 3 workshops in Ecuador for therapists and other helpers. And then we also did one for Black women. And we're planning also to do some more workshops in Jamaica. And one of the things that we are going to be doing is seeing if having these groups, particularly in areas, maybe for example Jamaica, where you have mostly Black people there, so even the environment contributes to the setting, would help contribute to relieving symptoms of racial trauma. And so that's something we're sort of actively trying to raise funds for. And we have some colleagues at the University of Washington who are also interested in partnering with us on this. And so that's coming up. And also there's a big interest in addressing trauma in veterans. And so some research that I did in partnership with some clinicians at the VA is we had put together a group training protocol for racial trauma, not a psychedelic protocol, just like a cognitive behavioral based protocol. And that's now being actually implemented at 20 different VAs right now. But also we're interested in getting the healing of psychedelics to this group as well. And right now there are many veterans who are pushing, they're pushing in the States, and we're seeing some things happen. And they also have a voice here in Canada. And I actually wrote an article for the Journal of Military, Veteran, and Family Health called "It's Time for Better Tools," because, as a trauma researcher myself, I do think it is critically important that those who've been serving our country have access to the best treatments that we have to offer them. And when the tools that we have don't work, we need to be able to offer them something else. So, and then finally, we've been developing some training programs at the University of Ottawa, and we have right now 2 micro programs, one in psychedelics and spirituality, and one in psychedelic science. And each program is 3 graduate courses that give you that little credential in that area. And also we are expanding this. We're developing a certificate program, and we have a master's program in psychedelics and consciousness studies that is scheduled to launch this fall. And so that's very exciting. So for those of you who might be interested, check us out online, because it's an online program. So very cool. And let's see. And that's all I have for today. So thank you very much. And if you're interested in supporting our work, there's the link to our lab, and you can learn more. And here's my contact information. So, thank you.
Amy? Are you there, Amy? Perfect.
Hello.
Hey, we hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Now, if you want to support and become part of the psychedelic movement, feel free to donate to MAPS Canada at the link in the description below. Thank you for helping our mission to support equitable access to legal and regulated psychedelic medicines for all Canadians.